rejection of the truth. Jesus is Lord.
God is an all-consuming fire, burning away all false desires.
Yeah, he's gonna burn it away. The holy furnace ablaze.
Well, hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome back to 2 Peter. Welcome back to this study on heretics. Again, like I said, I believe Jude is talking about those who creep in, who are among us, while Peter, as we will see again, is focused on those who are behind the pulpit, those who are leading the charge. And as we've seen last time, Jude was using a few Old Testament examples of God's judgment coming upon those who are ungodly, those who will rebel against God. It's a serious call to not only that there will be consequences for those who will refuse God's lordship and who are among his people right now, but at the same time, a reminder of how we can be infected by such sinners. Right? Remember how Sodom and Gomorrah infected the rest of the cities around. Now we move to Peter, where he will use some of the same examples, at least 2 out of 3. He'll change it for a new one, where Jude talked about the Exodus. Peter himself will be talking about Noah's flood. Now, of course, Peter's focus is slightly different. He will talk about the coming judgment, but he'll put a greater emphasis on the need to stand strong against such evil. He's going to present at least 2 men who stood against evil all around them, the corruption that was all around, like Noah did in his time. He is clearly calling his audience to stand against opposition, because these leaders will be really leading a lot of people astray, and you might be the only one standing for what is right. So where Jude talked about the infection of sin in the church, Peter will be talking about our call to stay strong when everybody else is getting infected, like Lot did. And when we get to Lot, we will definitely have some questions about what is Peter talking about. Lot the just, really? We will see when we get there. If I keep that in mind, he's still focused on a coming judgment, but a little bit more on our call to stay strong when everything else and everybody else seems to be falling away. Slightly different than what Jude was talking about. But I digress. Let's begin with verse 4. He says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell or Tartarus, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment." And we'll stop here. Now don't miss that it begins by saying "for." This little "for" brings us back to verse 3, where verse 3, where he was talking about the fact that these false teachers, there's a prowling vengeance, judgment of God coming upon them, right? It's not idle, it's not asleep. It will hit them. And he can say this, he can really promise that there will be a judgment against these false teachers because God did it with the angels. These greater beings that were just made to worship God but did rebel, at least 1/3, they got the judgment of God. Or at least for now, they're being kept for a day of judgment. So for sure, God will also do it to these false teachers. No matter how high up they might be, how important, how much we may praise them right now in the Christian culture, there will become a judgment for them, because there was one for the angel. Interesting how he doesn't focus on what their sin was. Last time we had a bit more detail about how they rebelled and lost their authority and all that. Here's just they sinned. They sinned, and they're waiting for this judgment. They are in Tartarus, or hell. In Greek mythology, Tartarus is considered like the deepest place of the underworld, where the gods or the other magical beings are being kept for a great judgment. Hence why Peter would be using it here to talk about the angels, these great spiritual beings. But this is when he changes his focus. Where Jude was just going again and again about these people did that, judgment. They did this, judgment. They did this, judgment. Peter's going to change it up a little bit. He moves on to his second example, which is the flood for him. And he says this in verse 5. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. So he's still talking about judgment that came upon the ancient world. He again doesn't go into many details of what they did as sin, just as they were ungodly. But he does focus a lot about the preserving power of God. Right? He puts that little but God is one of those little phrases in the Bible that just reminds us that God is in control. But God preserved Noah. And he preserved a herald of righteousness. A man who is holding strong to God's truth, what he had at his time, and compared to us, it's the gospel, the righteousness of God. That's what we are holding on to. But God was able to preserve this man who stood for righteousness in an ungodly world and preserve them from the great judgment to come. Keep that in mind. God's ability to preserve is what is on the forefront of this verse. Like in the next one, and I should say the next story in the next couple of verses, 6 to 8, where we're going to finish off. So he starts by saying, again, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. So also here for an instant, because he's again putting the accent on the judgment of God. It brought extinction. Remember the last time I talked about how the word destruction, he was presenting, the fire of Sodom and Gomorrah like an example of eternal fire. And he was talking about the word extinction, eternal punishment, if you will, that happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. They were an example that God does judge the ungodly. Again, no description of what he means by ungodly, just they're against God. And there's a judgment for it. And now we get to that interesting part. And if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. Now we stop and say, wait, righteous Lot? Isn't that the guy who was willing to give up his daughters to a bunch of sexual perverts to protect 2 other people? Isn't that the guy who ended up being seduced by them later on and then having children with both of these daughters? Yes. God says righteous Lot. Now, of course, we could talk about imputed righteousness, but I don't think that's what Peter's getting at here. It's not imputed righteousness. This is about how he was righteous or just in his attachment to God, which again bothers us. But that's why we look at the entire Bible to try to understand what God's talking about. Here's how Peter describes it. He says he was greatly distressed. Now this word distress is interesting because it really talks about being worn down. He was worn down, really tired by the sensual conduct of the wicked. Hearing it, seeing it before his eyes over and over again, it was just wearing him down. I think that's interesting. Because we, especially in the West, the Christian church here, are being worn down by the society we're living in. That's very sensual, really giving over to our desires. Just live however you want. And we're seeing it get worse and worse and worse. And it's wearing us down, right? I mean, just think about, as Christians, what we do or watch, how we entertain ourselves by stuff that we condemn in the Bible, we condemn in our preaching, we condemn in our lives, but we're willing to watch it. We're being worn down by society that says, it's okay, entertain yourself. I don't say this as a judgment against anybody. I was one of those people. I used to play video games that were very violent and watch that kind of movie that now that I've stopped, and once in a while that I still look at one of them, I have to stop the movie saying, what am I watching? My conscience has been a bit more cleansed, and I realized, I can't believe I was okay with this. Well, it's because I was being worn down by society that kept saying, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. I think that's where he's getting at, because he continues in verse 8 by saying, as a parenthesis, and they even put it in the text, Just make sure that you're still not saying, righteous Lot, really? Just Lot, are you sure? Well, yes, here's why. For as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Now, what's interesting is that the word tormented really means to be examined by torture. Think about what it means to examine someone through torture. It really means that you're wearing them down through this physical or mental attack, bringing down their resolves so they'll be more prone to do or say what you tell them to. That's what was going on with Lot. He was being broken down by what he was seeing. Now, he's the one that chose this place, yes. He's still the one that behaved wrongly while trying to protect these two men. But do think about that. Even though he was worn down, even though we know parts of his story with his daughters, he was still willing to sacrifice a lot to save these two men. He knew what was going to happen to them and anybody who tried to help them, and he was willing to help them. He was willing to stand up for what's right, even though he was being worn down by society in which he was in, to the point where he was probably willing to just look the other way, which bothers us that he would do that, right? But when it came to push came to shove, he was willing to do what was right, what was righteous, and protect these men. Did he do it in the wrong way? Absolutely. But he was still trying to behave in a righteous and a just way. So don't miss the fact that Peter uses two words about being worn down by this evil and yet doing the right thing, because he will be calling these people, these listening to him right now, who are being overwhelmed or attacked by false teachers, tell them, stand up. Even if you think everything is against you, stand up. Even if you've kind of gone with the flow long enough and you're starting to realize, well, this is wrong, stand up. When we get back to Peter next time, he's going to, remind us that God is with us in that. He's the one who's going to be doing the preserving, right? The keeping, like he did with Lot and Noah. But for now, just take this as a call to stand. No matter how tired you might be, if you think something's wrong, the teacher is wrong, and people telling you, don't judge him, he's the man of God. Stand up. Don't do it in a prideful, arrogant way. I'm so spiritual, you guys are wrong. No, in the humility of recognizing that we're not better, but we're still recognizing this is wrong. What he's teaching is not biblical. What's going on in the church, the way it's behaving right now, it's not right. Stand up. Stand up. May this be a good call for us to say it's never too late. We're not perfect. Do it in humility and love, but we need to stand for truth, for righteousness, for what is just, for what is of God. But that said, brothers and sisters, be blessed.
Turn of the day, somebody come on.
They're lower in the mountains and rocks till they